When humanity learned to wield fire in war, it didn't just change how we kill. It changed who we are. On February 19, 1945, on the black sands of Iwo Jima, dozens of Sherman tanks roared ashore. Among them were 8 that looked no different from any ordinary tank. But inside, their main guns had been replaced with a weapon that could turn the entire island into hell itself: fire. And those 8 vehicles alone, according to statistics, caused roughly 1/3 of all Japanese casualties on the island. In this video, we're not just going to mention flamethrower tanks as some shocking detail. We're going to track the story backwards: why the Americans were forced to create this kind of weapon, how it was actually used on Iwo Jima, and what psychological price both sides had to pay. This is not just a story about the technology of war. It's about a much more uncomfortable question. When you're facing a fortress buried deep underground, does any line still remain between what is necessary and what is cruel? In today's episode, we're going to answer all of that. Long before Sherman flamethrowers crawled up the black sands of Iwo Jima, the idea of killing with fire had haunted warfare for more than a millennium. The Byzantines had Greek fire, a mysterious liquid that could burn even on water, terrifying Arab fleets so badly that just seeing it was enough to cause panic. No one remembers the exact formula anymore, but the fear outlived every record ever written. History then slid through a series of insane ways to use fire, burning animals and driving them toward enemy lines just to spread chaos. That is war in its rawest, most stripped-down form. By World War I, the Germans brought the modern flamethrower to the front lines, not just to kill, but to shatter the enemy's will. The jets of flame didn't just burn out trenches. They incinerated the last remaining sense of safety that soldiers clung to. But the bitter irony was that this was also a weapon that could kill its own operator. One wrong gust of wind was all it took. So in this arms race, are humans truly controlling fire? Or are they slowly being consumed by it? And then, as World War turned the entire planet into a giant furnace, that 1,000-year obsession with fire was condensed down into a single backpack on the shoulders of an ordinary infantryman. Before World War II, the Allies were almost indifferent to flamethrowers. Only when they saw the Germans using them to break enemy morale did the Americans rush the M1 into the field. 3 metal cylinders on the back, weighing over 30 kilos, an effective range of just 20 to 40 meters, and 7 to 10 seconds of continuous flame. It sounded like a crude, improvised weapon, yet it was the golden key against stubborn bunkers. A gasoline-diesel napalm mixture burning at around 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit clung to everything. The tactic was to soak the target first, then ignite, letting the fire crawl deep into the fortifications. It was a weapon of desperation, because the man carrying it had to crawl into the killing ground, but also an ultimate weapon, because nothing else shattered the enemy so quickly. In that moment, was the flamethrower operator the hunter, or the man with the biggest bounty on his head? You know, a weapon is only truly ultimate when it meets the enemy it was born to destroy. And on Iwo Jima, that enemy was the Japanese bunker and tunnel system. The Japanese didn't just dig holes and crawl in. They built an entire maze underground. Pillboxes laid out in zigzags, dead angles calculated to the inch, channels cut so they could kick grenades back out in the final second. Against grenades and artillery, it was almost an impregnable fortress. But fire plays by different rules. It doesn't need a direct hit, doesn't need to punch through armor, doesn't care about shrapnel angles. It just needs to pour in, burn out the oxygen, turn a sealed space into a furnace, and leave the rest to heat and panic. That's why the flamethrower became the key to Japanese bunkers. Researchers still argue over whether this was a way of dying that was too inhumane. But on Iwo Jima, the answer was in the screams echoing out of cave mouths, sounds no military report could ever truly capture. So in a war of total destruction, is there really any room left for the idea of being just brutal enough? Even so, every golden key on the battlefield comes with a price. And in this case, that price was strapped directly to the flamethrower operator's back. Imagine you are that man. 70 pounds of metal and fuel on your shoulders, standing out on the battlefield like a glowing sign that says, "Shoot me first." For the weapon to work, you have to crawl right into grenade range, right into machine gun range. The closer you get, the more effective the flame becomes, but the closer you are to the gate of death. The enemy knows this perfectly well. If they can just kill that one man, the bunker lives for one more day. So every gun barrel, every sniper, every artillery piece gives priority to a single target. On Iwo Jima, 94% of individual flamethrower operators were killed, a number that comes close to a pre-signed death sentence. So, were they the wielders of an inhumane weapon? Or soldiers forced to choose death in order to blow open the first door for their comrades? If the flamethrower operator was practically a dead man walking, then sooner or later, the high command had to find a way to separate the flame from the vulnerable human back. And the simplest solution in a mechanized war was this: bolt it onto steel. From the blood-soaked lessons of the Solomon Islands, the Americans began mounting flamethrowers on tanks. The first experimental model was the M3 Stuart Satan. Longer range, about 40 seconds of continuous flame, but in exchange for thin armor and worrying reliability, it broke down, malfunctioned, and failed precisely when it was needed most. Even so, every time Satan worked smoothly, Japanese bunkers went up in flames, enough to convince the US military that this idea was headed in the right direction. So, just a few months before Iwo Jima, they upgraded the whole concept under the M4A3 Sherman chassis. Remove the main gun, replace it with a flamethrower system, cram in around 300 gallons of fuel, extend the range to 150 yards, and unleash a total of 80 seconds of hell. From the outside, it looked like a normal Sherman, and that very normality was the real nightmare for the Japanese. The Sherman flamethrowers were ready, but to understand why they became a decisive weapon, we have to look at the monster they were about to face: the island of Iwo Jima itself. For nearly a year, the Japanese didn't build a defensive line. They built an entirely different world beneath the ground. Around 11 miles of interconnected tunnels, more than 5,000 caves, 1,500 concrete fortifications, and 21,000 soldiers who had been ordered by General Kuribayashi. No pointless bonsai charges. Each man was to try to kill 10 Americans before he died. This was not a battle to win. It was a battle to make the enemy pay so much that they would hesitate in the future. Meanwhile, the Americans believed they could soften up the island. 74 days of bombing, constant naval gunfire, tens of thousands of tons of explosives poured down. But when the dust finally settled, a harsh truth emerged. Only about 200 out of 1,500 fortifications had been destroyed. The rest stayed silent, waiting. After all those months turning Iwo Jima into an underground fortress, it was finally the Americans' turn to sit the real exam. And they began that exam almost completely blind to what was waiting for them. On February 19, 1945, the landing craft dropped their ramps onto the black sand. At first, there was silence. No artillery, no machine guns. Many Marines thought, maybe those 74 days of bombardment actually did the job. But then, as Indy Nidell likes to say, that's when hell takes the safety off. The entire hillside and every cave mouth erupted in fire at once. By nightfall, they had advanced less than 700 yards and paid for it with 2,400 casualties. That was just the first day.
Pinned down. We want to pull the beach over our head. Medical corpsmen, get our wounded out fast.
And because of that, the very next day, the High Command was forced to play its trump card: the Sherman flamethrowers. At first, they were just emergency support for units pinned down near the airfields. But hour by hour, they started to become the main spearhead. In that context, was a flamethrower tank a savior or a sign that the war had just climbed to a new level of brutality? I am. But war is rarely a one-sided story. If American fire turned the tunnels into mass graves, then the Japanese reaction slid just as steadily into the realm of desperation. When they realized that their 47mm anti-tank guns were almost useless against the Sherman's frontal armor, Japanese gun crews were forced to watch the flamethrower tanks crawl closer and closer, as helpless as the infantry in the trenches. And then the tactics changed. Instead of firing, they carried the explosives themselves. Soldiers clutching demolition charges ran straight into the flanks of the tanks, trading one life to save the men in the bunkers. Flame Sherman number 438 was destroyed exactly that way, with 3 members of its crew killed on the spot. At the command level, General Kuribayashi had to report to Tokyo that flamethrower tanks were causing more horrific losses than any bombardment, and that he had no effective countermeasure. When both doctrine and firepower fail, what remains is naked willpower, and the decision of how many extra minutes of life your own death can buy for your comrades. However, if the Japanese paid with men hurling themselves at tanks with explosives, the Americans were not spared by the weapon they had created either. The cost wasn't just counted in fuel, steel, or maintenance hours. It was counted in the sleep of the men inside those machines. At night on Iwo Jima, when the guns fell silent, American engineers and mechanics barely slept. They crawled under the hulls, welding and patching, checking lines and valves, mixing thicker fuel so that at dawn it could be pumped back into the tanks, sending them out to the front again. Spew fire, return to refill, then charge forward once more. Statistics show that flame tanks reduced Marine casualties by around 40%, a number any officer would dream of. But in return, the crews had to watch people burn at point-blank range through their own sights. The war may have officially ended on paper in 1945, but for many of them, those pits of fire on Iwo Jima kept burning in their minds for decades afterward. If the long nights spent fixing tanks and the haunted dreams were the psychological price to be paid, then sooner or later all of that was going to be settled in a single day. And for Iwo Jima, that day was March 21st. After more than a month of plowing up every inch of ground, about 3,000 Japanese soldiers were still dug inside the last clusters of caves and bunkers. The 6 surviving Sherman flamethrowers were reinforced by 4 new ones brought in from Hawaii. This time, they weren't just supporting the infantry anymore. They launched the largest flamethrower assault in the entire Pacific Theater. In just one day, roughly 8,000 gallons of fuel were fired, in exchange for 92 American dead and 257 wounded, a figure far lower than what a bare assault without flamethrower tanks would likely have cost. The final organized Japanese defensive line was crushed. The only question left is, was that a victory? Or a live demo of a new kind of apocalypse in modern warfare? And when the last flame died out on the black sands, the question left behind wasn't just who won, but what did we use to win? Of the 8 original Sherman flamethrowers, 2 were destroyed. The others didn't really survive so much as get cut apart for spare parts to keep the last few running until the end of the battle. Out of 21,000 Japanese soldiers, fewer than 200 surrendered. The rest remained in the very tunnels they had spent a year carving into the island. Many American veterans later admitted, without flamethrower tanks, Iwo Jima might not have been taken at all, or the price would have been even more horrifying. And yet, at the same time, that very success paved the way for later generations of flamethrower tanks like the M67 Zippo in Vietnam. So is the legacy of flame tanks a tactical victory, or a moral fracture we still haven't managed to mend to this day? If February 19th was the moment the Americans realized that this island won't die from bombs, then the days that followed, with flamethrower tanks, were when the Japanese understood that we are dying slowly underground. Once they found their rhythm, the Flame Shermans began doing exactly what they were built to do, spewing thick streams of fire into pillboxes, cave mouths, and tunnel entrances. But the truly terrifying part wasn't what happened outside. It was what came after. The burning mixture of gasoline, oil, and napalm seeped into every crack, every vent, every side passage. When it met ammunition or fuel stores, it set off chain reactions, turning the entire tunnel network into a series of underground explosions, burying and burning alive those trapped inside. Often, after firing, American troops would detonate explosives to seal the entrances, leaving behind only the final sounds below, the last grenades, gunshots fired at the enemy, or at themselves. You don't need much imagination to picture it. Just ask yourself, down in that tunnel, would you choose fire, collapsing rock, or the last bullet?